Appreciate the thought. Remember, if you'd ever like to work with me, I'd love to come out to you. It is over 20 hours of training with a flight review, an IPC, emergency training, a bunch of FAA wings credit. A Vemco insurance even gives you a 10% discount on your insurance. So I really, really appreciate you listening in on this class. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you come meet me at a national show. If you ever need anything, call or email me anytime. And thanks for being such a good pilot and reviewing the IFR basics with me. Hey, how y'all doing? It's Gary, the guy in the pink shirt. If I haven't met you before, I'd love to see you out in public. If you're just walking around and you see a guy in a bright pink shirt, it's probably me. Come say hi. If you haven't met me yet, I got a little over 8,000 hours as an ATP. I'm a master CFI IIMEI, and many people consider me the top expert in single pilot IFR using Avidyne, Autopilot's Garmin, and ForeFlight. And I was very lucky to be awarded the 2019 National Instructor of the Year. That's enough about me. Let's get right into GPS and procedures. I need to kind of start with the basics. So GPS, or what ICAO calls Global Navigation Satellite Systems, GNSS, has 32 satellites with an accuracy of about 26 feet. So if you take those 32 satellites, but they're owned by the Department of Defense, you need a minimum of 4 to do a GPS approach, and that can either be LNAV or L/VNAV, lateral with vertical navigation that's approved. So what is LAWS? Well, local area augmentations, also called by ICAO ground-based augmentation system, has an accuracy of 3 feet. Well, that sounds great. Unfortunately, it is a project postponed by the FAA indefinitely. It is a privately owned system with Category 3, meaning full auto land and 0/0 visibility in development. Unfortunately, it is only at 2 airports and only for use by the owners, Continental Airlines, which most people call United, but it is actually Continental that's the owner. So you're probably more familiar with the term WAAS, or Wide Area Augmentation System, which ICAO calls Space-Based Augmentation System. And basically what we do is we just build towers all over the U.S., and we know where the towers are. Like, I know there's a tower 20 miles from Decatur Airport in Texas, we'll say, and I know it's 321 meters high, and I know exactly where it is, latitude and longitude. And then all they do is they hook up a GPS receiver to the antenna, and it listens to where the GPS satellites think it is, and then they just correct for the built-in errors. Now, here's a critical thing. The WAAS antennas never talk to your airplane. I've seen so many really smart instructors point out antennas on the bottom of an airplane and say, well, that's your WAAS antenna. No, WAAS antennas aren't on the bottom of the airplane. What happens with those correction factors is they're actually sent to relay stations. And those correction factors are sent up to the satellites, and the satellites send down the satellite information plus the WAAS correction factor. So remember, all WAAS antennas are GPS antennas, and they've got to be on the top of the plane, or you wouldn't get a signal. Now, if you see an antenna on the bottom of the plane, it's probably an ADS-B out and ADS-B in antenna. ADS-B out takes your WAAS position from your WAAS GPS and sends it down to the ADS-B towers so everybody can see you on traffic with TIS-B. But remember, WAAS information only comes from the GPS satellites, and all WAAS antennas has got to be pointed up. So let's talk a little bit more about WAAS, or what ICAO calls Space-Based Augmentation System. The beauty of this is anybody with a WAAS navigator can use one. And there's a bunch of them. So if you look at LPV approaches, there are 3 times more LPV approaches than ILS. In fact, with LPV, you can get into 1,900 more airports that don't even have an ILS. Now, WAAS is not LPV, WAAS is LP. So localizer performance or just plain WAAS approaches without approved vertical guidance are in places where terrain or obstructions do not allow vertically guided LPV minima. So if you actually take a moment and pull out the San Diego Localizer 27 approach, San Diego International's Kilo Sierra Alpha November, it's a major Bravo airport and they can't put an ILS to 27 because of obstructions. They can only do a localizer approach. Well, that's the exact same thing with LP and LPV. If there are no obstacles and we can guarantee safe obstacle clearance on a glide path all the way down to the touchdown zone, booyah, you get LPV. If there are obstacles that would prevent a glide path all the way down, obstacle clear to the runway zone, then it's only going to be an LP. If there are so many obstacles that you can't get in even with LP, they're going to leave it as LNAV. So you might want to look at Decatur Airport. Kilo Lima Uniform Delta. We have an LPV approach to runway 17, and the approach to runway 35 is RNAV only, just plain LNAV. And it's because of obstacles. So how much better is WAAS than GPS? Well, GPS has a horizontal accuracy of 9.5 feet. I think that's pretty good, but WAAS is 2.3 feet. Vertical GPS has an accuracy of 14 feet. WAAS is 4 feet. So WAAS is a significant improvement, and that's what allows us to get as low as 200 or 250 feet, exactly like an ILS. Let's do another comparison to really set it in. So if you have a non-WAAS GPS, full scale from left to right in terminal mode is 1 mile, which means if you were full scale off to the left, you'd be a half mile off course. En route, it opens up to 2 miles, which means if you were full scale deflection, you'd be 1 mile off course. And at which point people go, ooh, 1 mile off course is a lot. Well, not if you compare it to a Victor Airway, right? So you should never use Victor Airways with a couple rare exceptions. You should always go GPS almost direct. If you do fly a Victor Airway, I would encourage you to leave your autopilot in GPS steering because it's more accurate. What's funny is occasionally a center controller will say, well, you look like you're a little off center on the airway. All you got to do is say, hey, I'm using GPS, and they'll go, okay. GPS is more accurate than even center radars are. So a non-WAAS GPS approach is 0.3 nautical miles, full scale to left to right, which means if you were full scale deflection down at the missed approach point, you'd be 900 feet off course. So 900 feet off center line, there's a big obstacle area, right? That's why people preferred ILS, because ILS full scale left to right at the missed approach point or end of the runway is 760 feet, which means you're only 380 feet off center line, even if you go full scale. So funny story, I do 3-day mastery courses, and the very low time private pilots hire me, love to work with you. 60,000 hour airline captain chief instructors hire me. So one of the chief instructors for Southwest Airlines, 60,000 hours, hires me to do a 3-day training. And I'm flattered. I'm happy to work with him. But why would a 60,000 hour guy need my help? Well, because Southwest Airlines does not have WAAS. He's never shot any WAAS approaches. And he certainly doesn't know how to fly single pilot IFR because his full-time gig is teaching airline crew, right? So he puts in an Avidyne in his very nice Piper Apache, and the first day he goes, listen, I totally appreciate you teaching me how to work my Avidyne, but I just want you to know I'm always going to do an ILS because I know ILS is more accurate. Well, no. LP, localizer performance, which is a WAAS approach, is only 0.1 nautical mile or a 300-foot full-scale deflection. So WAAS approaches are more than 25% more accurate than an ILS. In fact, you should always do an RNAV LPV approach instead of an ILS, in my opinion, because we know they're more accurate and there are no autopilot limitations. There are many, many ILS around the United States, and I'm sure around the world, but I know of several around the around the United States rather, that prohibit the autopilot in the last 200 or 300 feet. So if you look at the ILS 3.1 to Ardmore, it says you must disengage the autopilot at 1360. That's because at 1310 feet, the localizer and or glide path will take a wild swing due to a localized magnetic interference, like if you fly over a big bunch of railroad tracks or something. So if you're instrument rated and you can think back to your training, or if you're a student and you're taking your training, or if you're double I, hey, thanks for hanging out, think about all the students that overcorrect as they get closer because the ILS is based on angular deflection. Now imagine a wild swing at 300 feet AGL. LP and LPV in this case on the RNAV 3.1 are much more stable. It's a lateral deviation. They never swing and they don't care if there's railroad tracks or anything else in the way. So if you have an option, you're always going to do the RNAV versus an ILS. The only reason I'm ever going to do an ILS is because GPS is out. So if you have a WAAS navigation, do you still have to do a VOR check? No. You are actually not legally required to do VOR checks anymore if you have a WAAS navigator. I certainly recommend you do, and I still do, and I teach, all over the country and the world, and I make all my students do it, because every day the FAA will release NOTAMs that, hey, the military is going to mess with GPS. So if you're flying along in the clouds at night and GPS goes blink because of a national emergency or just a routine GPS testing NOTAM, how are you going to navigate? Well, you're going to have to join a Victor Airway, you're going to have to go to a VOR, and you're going to have to look for something called a MON airport. So everybody thinks we're going to get rid of all the VORs. That's totally not true. In fact, we're improving a lot of them. We are removing a lot of VORs, but even the low altitude VORs, which were always good to 40 nautical miles, we're now improving. So all low and high altitude VORs that we keep are increased of a service volume up to 70. That's 70 nautical miles if you're 5,000 feet up. So in case of a GPS outage, you just fly Victor Airways and VORs, and except for a couple little spots in the Rockies in the western United States, there's always going to be a MON airport available within 77 nautical miles. And that means that the MON airport will either have an ILS, localizer, or VOR approach, or several, that do not require ADF, DME, or radar. In other words, you will be able to complete it with no outside help using raw data only. So if you're flying along, and you're looking at your IFR low altitude chart, you got to look for an airport that has the word MON reverse printed in green, like the 2 in circle. You'll notice the airport to the left is not a MON airport. Now, it's green on the low altitude chart, meaning it has an instrument approach. But those instrument approaches would require either GPS, radar, ADF, or DME. The 2 circled do not. So you should practice en route holds. You should practice VOR approaches only. I'm a huge fan of autopilots. I want you to autopilot only, never hand fly anything, because autopilots make you safer if you know how to use them by reducing workload and preventing decision fatigue and ultimately adrenaline paralysis. However, do me a favor, once a month, don't even put a flight plan in your new shiny Garmin GTN. Just file an IFR flight plan, take off, and navigate to a VOR, fly a Victor Airway to an airport, and hand fly a VOR circling approach to land, because that's what you may need to do. And on your way back, ask for a random en route hold at a VOR. Make sure you keep the old skills up. So GPS, Gary's Pink Source or Gary's Pink Shirt, whatever, is always better than a random magnetic nav aid like a VOR, localizer, or ILS. But you still need to know how to work them. Autopilots are always better, but you still need to know how to hand fly. So I do recommend y'all do a VOR check, and that's every 30 days. You need to log the place you did it, the amount of error, the date, and your signature. So where are you going to put that? Well, it doesn't really matter. It's kind of like car insurance. You just got to be able to find it when the cop checks, right? So you just need to be able to prove that you did a VOR check if you ever have a problem. You can put it on a sticky note. You can write it on the bottom of your foot. A lot of people put it in like a notebook in the airplane. I'm a huge fan of ForeFlight. I just create a new entry and put it into my ForeFlight logbook. So what I do is I put it in as a VOR check as my departure point to no destination. And then under comments, well, let's look at this one. The place was the VOR test facility 25 right at Long Beach. +1 was ±0. Number 2 was ±0. So number 1 and number 2 nav were perfect. The date on this one was 6/14/18, and the signature's Gary D. Reeves Super Pilot. So I was teaching this up at Epic. I do teach at a lot of conventions, and anybody would like me to come teach to your group, I'm always available with quite a bit of advance notice, unfortunately. And the head of the safety committee, a real good friend of mine, Peter King, goes, hey, that's not legal because that's not a signature. Well, not quite right. There is a federal law called e-sign, which on any federal document, including your IACRA applications, your FAA Med Express, an electronic signature is legal on any federal document. So guess what? Just typing your name makes it legal. Now, if you've been flying long enough and you're as old as I am, you might remember when we had non-WAAS GPS, you were required to do something called a RAIN check, a receiver check. Are we going to have enough satellites by the time I get to Dallas to do a GPS approach? So do you still have to do RAIN checks? Nope, not at all. You never have to do a RAIN check as long as you have a WAAS navigator. So now I want to talk about probably the biggest confusion in GPS approaches, and that's something called RNP. So if we look at the two approaches into Omaha, they're both RNAV approaches to runway 18 at Omaha Epley. The one on the left is the RNAV GPS, Yankee runway 18, that is an RNP approach. The one on the right is the RNAV RNP approach that requires GPS. I'm not sure if I helped clarify that, but let's look at a killer note on the bottom of the right. It is authorization required. So what does RNP even stand for? Well, they're both RNP. One is based on GPS and one is based on another type of RNAV system. So RNAV is not GPS. GPS is one type of area navigation, but there are dual DME RNAV systems. There are a bunch of different RNAV systems. GPS just happens to be one of them and the cheapest and easiest to put in your airplane. So RNP just stands for the required navigation performance to complete the approach. So let's look at it again. The RNAV Yankee on the left is a WAAS approach with approved vertical guidance, and it has an LPV decision altitude. And the requirement to complete that approach is an RNP of 0.1 nautical miles or 600 feet. If you look at the one on the right, the RNAV Zulu has an RNP of 0.15 DA. It's higher than the LPV minimums. And this one includes RF legs, which is radius to fix. Essentially, it's a DME arc. Now, your airplane with an Avidyne, Garmin, Bendix King, WAAS GPS, with a good autopilot like a Garmin 500 or 600, an Avidyne DFC 90, or my favorite, the STEC 3100 or an STEC 55X, has no problem in GPS steering of doing DME arcs. And I got to tell you, it's totally capable of displaying a glide path on a curved arc, and your autopilot wouldn't know the difference. However, the RNAV Zulu is not using GPS. It's actually dual DME with an RNP of 0.15, which is 900 feet. So a lot of people say, well, I want to shoot the RNP approaches. Why? They're less accurate than the WAAS, and you can't do it because you're not authorized by the FAA administrator. So the confusion comes from flight planning. So let's take ForeFlight. And let's do a flight from Romeo Delta Kilo to Omaha Epley, Oscar Mike Alpha. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a procedure. I'm going to pick an approach. I'm going to do the RNAV Zulu because ForeFlight says the Zulu. And I know the runway's closed, but it's a good training exercise. I'm going to start it at Chad, add to route. And you notice ForeFlight doesn't come up with minima. So I have to manually add it in as 0.15. Close, add to route, and ForeFlight shows the RNP approach, no problem. It even shows all those little radius to fix turns that it creates little waypoints, alpha 01, alpha 02, alpha 03. Now, let's just try and replicate that on a Garmin GTN. Garmin makes a really nice touchscreen only navigator called a GTN 750 or GTN 750 TXI. Let's do it on a GTN 750. So I'm just going to add a waypoint, Omaha.
TAWS, system test OK.
Waypoint info. Let's look and see if it has the chart. So I'm going to touch approach. And hey, look at that. The GTN is going to give me the RNAV RNP chart. Great. So the chart's in the GTN. Let's just go ahead and load it. Load procedure, approach other, and where's the RNAV 18 Zulu? It's not there. So it shows the chart, but it won't let you load the approach. Well, I guess I'll do the RNAV Yankee, which gets me lower anyway. And then I got to figure out where I'm going to start it because I haven't looked at the chart yet. So I'll look at Canio just as a touch. And then let's look at the chart and see if there's a better place to start. And if I zoom in, maybe, yeah, probably going to start it at Glean. So I'll go back and load that approach from Glean, load and activate, and look at that. So the GTN has the RNAV RNP Zulu chart, but it doesn't have the nav data to load it as an approach. Okay, well, if you all know me, I'm a big fan of Avidyne. I think Avidyne's a little smarter. It's a little more advanced. So I bet you the Avidyne can do it. So let's try it on the Avidyne. So I'm going to look and see if the chart's in there. Hey, look at that. Just like a Garmin product, the Avidyne has the RNP chart. Now let's load the approach. And it doesn't come up when I try and load the procedure, only the Yankee. All right, well, I guess we'll do Glean. So it's not an Avidyne Jeppesen problem. It's not a Garmin problem. It's an authorization problem. The RNP requires authorization for the airplane and the crew by the FAA administrator. So if you look, all pilots may fly any RNAV GPS approach as long as they have an approach certified GPS unit. It doesn't have to be WAAS. It doesn't have to be WAAS. It could be a non-WAAS. You can fly an RNAV approach as long as there's non-WAAS minima, right? So if you had a little G1000 that's non-WAAS, well, you can fly any RNAV GPS approach. You just don't get the vertical guidance, right? Airline pilots can fly an RNAV RNP approaches if they receive the required FAA-approved training only in the airplane and equipment certified in the training. So let me make sure y'all get that. True or false? An airline captain that's authorized for RNAV RNP approaches at work in his Boeing 737 is also authorized, because he's been trained, to fly them in his Piper Saratoga. Totally false. I'm on the Avidyne Pilots Club on Facebook. I'm part of the Garmin Avionics Enthusiast on Facebook. And a guy put in one of the groups, I don't even remember, why won't my blank unit, I think it was an Avidyne, why won't my Avidyne let me fly an RNP approach? So I'm just being helpful. I'm like, hey, hi, it's the guy in the pink shirt. You're not authorized to fly RNP approaches. And I know he was mad because he typed back in all caps. I am authorized. I'm an airline captain for blank airline. Okay, I'm just being helpful. I'm just the guy in the pink shirt. Well, that's not quite true. You are authorized at work with a 2-pilot crew in a Boeing 737-whatever with the approved RNAV system that can do RF legs. You are not approved in your Piper Saratoga single pilot. And he responds back in, I don't know if he can make bolder caps, but he sure tried. You don't know what you're talking about. That's not true. I am authorized. Okay, well, go yell at Jeppesen. Jeppesen can't sell general aviation pilots the RNP database. They're not allowed to. Because remember, the RNP authorization required is specific to an airframe equipment and approved training for that. So even if you're an airline pilot, hey, thanks for listening in, you're not going to get it. And why would you care? The LPV approaches are better anyway. So let's talk about another kind of common confusion. The difference between an initial approach fix and an intermediate fix. Well, pretty clear Dory's only an intermediate fix and pretty clear that Seal Beach is an initial approach fix. But what happens when Cummum is marked as both? Well, you can't be both. You got to pick one. And really, the way you know if it's an intermediate fix or an initial approach fix, if you're direct to Cummum, is your turn angle inbound to final. So let's look at airplane in the top left corner. If he flies to Cummum, is the turn to final less than 90 degrees? Absolutely. In that case, it legally becomes an intermediate fix. And you still got to do the Tokyo drift, and you still have to do the legally required procedure turn. Because procedure turns are always required as published at intermediate fixes or initial approach fixes. So it doesn't matter if it's an intermediate fix, you still got to do the procedure turn. Unless on your RNAV approach, there's something called a terminal arrival area. And a terminal arrival area is kind of like a little mini star. And all it says is, listen, if you're going into Cummum with less than a 90-degree turn, as long as you hear the following, and you got to hear the magic words, direct Cummum cleared for the approach, in which case you don't need to do a procedure turn because it's actually published that the procedure turn is not used coming from that angle. So the trick is, did you hear direct Cummum? Yeah, great. Did you hear the magic words, cleared for the approach? If you hear direct Cummum, then you're not cleared for the approach and you need to clarify. If you hear direct Cummum cleared for the approach, you are authorized to use a terminal arrival area if it's published. So pretty much once you're within 30 miles, you can go down to 4,100 feet. Once you're within 14 miles, you can descend to 3,600 feet. The PT is no longer authorized and you can proceed straight in. Now, how about this guy? This guy is told direct FEBIT, cleared for the approach. Well, FEBIT's an initial approach fix, so Cummum cannot be because you only get one initial. And the easiest way to explain this to everybody is, how many first marriages can a person have? Well, one, right? And hopefully that worked out for you and that's the lifetime, love and you're happy. If you have a second marriage, it can't be the first, right? All except for a really good friend in California who is married, divorced, and remarried the same woman 4 or 5 times. So I hope it works for him this time. It didn't work out the first 4 times, but good luck. I'm not buying you any more toasters. But you only get one initial approach fix. So if I go to FEBIT, which is an initial approach fix, Cummum becomes an intermediate fix. And you notice the line from FEBIT says, no procedure turn. Now, this guy, direct Cummum, is the turn to final More than 90 degrees? Yes. Therefore, it's an initial approach fix, but doesn't matter. You still do the same procedure turn before going inbound. So if you're going to come them and you're not sure if you're supposed to do the procedure turn or not, just ask ATC. It's better to ask and make sure than do the wrong thing. So we know IF stands for intermediate fix. We know IAF stands for initial approach fix. Super bonus question to my fans out there. What the heck is an IFI on the RNAV Yankee 17 right? It's actually the identifier for the VOR. It doesn't stand for anything. That's the Morse code at the Kingfisher VOR. So let's do a quick review. There are GPS and WAAS approaches. GPS is LNAV. WAAS is LP. But there's LNAV or LNAV plus V. There's LP, localizer performance, or LP plus V. There's LPV, and then there's a non-WAAS approach, LNAV VNAV. So let's just go over all of them real quick. What is lateral navigation only or lateral navigation plus an advisory vertical guidance? Well, lateral navigation is non-WAAS, and the GPS approach mode is 0.3 nautical miles. Plus V is an advisory vertical guidance, not approved vertical navigation. AVG is advisory vertical guidance. So you get a glide path, but you are not approved to go below MDA, or you might hit something. There is no DA on a plus V approach. It's only an MDA. It is still a non-WAAS, but the plus V is only created by WAAS GPS. So a WAAS GPS can create an advisory glide path on a non-WAAS approach. You still got to stop at the MDA and fly forward to the missed approach point. Then you go missed. So let's do an LNAV. So here's lateral navigation only. My plane is outside of Seathern. After passing Seathern, I'm going to chop the power, dive, level off at 2,000, fly forward to Monkey, I guess. Then I'm going to dive, level off at 1280, fly forward to Xvigi. Then I'm going to dive down to 960, level off, fly forward, and at the missed approach point, if I don't see the airport, then go missed. That is a ton of work. That's a lot of what we call dive and drive. And this is what it kind of looks like if you have an Avidyne 550. So you'll notice it says lateral navigation. There is no plus V, right? So the synthetic vision shows it. And you'll notice on the ARS view that you get lateral course guidance at the bottom. You still get the green total velocity vector on an Avidyne, but there is no vertical guidance at all. Now, if we do an LNAV plus V approach, same approach. The difference is you don't have to dive and drive. You can follow an advisory glide path created by your WAAS navigator. It only appears on the leg outside the final approach fix. So the final approach fix would be Monkey, and I know it's not really a final approach fix because you just pick up a glide path, but it's considered final approach fix for LNAV only. You see outside of Seathern 3000, outside of Monkey 2000, you don't ever have to do that step down with a glide path. There is no reason to increase your workload and dive 1,000 feet because the glide path will be above you even at 3,000. So just stay at 3,000. So all you got to do is fly forward at 3,000. When you pick up the advisory glide path, plus V is advisory in nature only, instead of doing a bunch of power things and all that, just pull back the power 5 or 6 inches, let your autopilot track it nice and smooth all the way down to the MDA of 960, at which point you must disengage approach mode. Otherwise, your autopilot will continue tracking a glide slope below MDA and put you in danger. You must get into altitude hold. So if you're flying an STEC 55X, you're in approach mode. At MDA, make sure you hit heading which you should have lined up with the final approach course, and that will automatically engage altitude hold. You gotta break out of approach mode, otherwise it will try and recapture the glide slope and continue tracking you down into the danger zone. So you always have to level off at an MDA. So if you ever see plus V on an approach, add vertical, stop high. Then you fly forward and go missed. But it is a whole lot easier because as we fly, if we look at the Avidyne, all we're going to do is just fly forward. We just stay at 3,000 and let the autopilot track the glide path down. So a lot fewer power changes and a lot less button pushes. So let's go to LP. LP is WAAS. So WAAS is not LPV. WAAS is LP, localizer performance. So the slide accidentally says localizer precision. That is incorrect. This is localizer performance. Sorry for the typo. That's a WAAS approach. Localizer performance or LP approach mode goes down to 0.1 nautical mile. You stop at the MDA. And go. So LP is still a dive and drive. If you get LP plus V, it's a lot easier. It's still advisory vertical guidance. You still don't have an approved decision altitude. You still have to stop at an MDA, but the GPS internally creates the glide path. Don't forget, you still have to stop at the MDA. Then you fly forward to the missed approach point. Then you go missed. So pick up the glide path, one constant descent, level off, go missed. I want to really emphasize this. LP plus V is not obstacle clear all the way down to the runway. You see those obstacles right there? On this approach, it's LP only. If you don't disengage or break out of approach mode and you don't level off, the autopilot cannot tell the difference between plus V and V. All glide paths look the same to an autopilot. It doesn't matter if it's coming off an ILS or an LNAV plus V or an LP plus V or LNAV VNAV. All glide paths just look identical. It doesn't know you need to stop. And putting in an altitude pre-select has no effect whatsoever. I want to say that again. Putting in a altitude pre-select or putting in minimums has no effect on autopilots once they're in approach mode tracking a glide path. You gotta disengage it. So I prefer heading and an altitude hold, because if you don't, it will run you right into those obstacles. So it even says on it that you are not clear obstacles on the glide path down to the touchdown zone. So you can pick up the glide path, great. But if you descend below the glide path, you're going to hit those obstacles. So please make sure you know the difference. Now, if you look at a Jeppesen chart, most WAAS approaches that are LPV actually have LPV, LNAV, VNAV, and LNAV all on the same chart, and there's 3 arrows down on the bottom. So if you were doing LNAV only, lateral navigation, you would dive down to 1360, level off, fly forward to the missed approach point, and then go missed. If you're doing L/VNAV, lateral and vertical navigation, it's non-WAAS, but it is approved all the way down to a DA. You can get a little bit lower on the glide path, but you go missed at 1255. So with a decision altitude, you actually go missed before the missed approach point. LPV, approved vertical navigation with WAAS, gets you even lower, go all the way down to 1060, but again, you go missed before the missed approach point, because there is no missed approach point with approved vertical navigation. LNAV, VNAV, ILS, LPV, there's a decision altitude. Plus V, LNAV, LNAV plus V, LP, LP plus V, localizer or VOR only. You level off at the MDA and you fly forward to the missed approach point, and then you go missed. So what is LPV? And again, I'm very sorry for the typo. It's not localizer precision. It is localizer performance. So localizer performance is WAAS because LP is WAAS. And the LP approach mode goes down to 0.1 nautical miles. The difference is this is not advisory vertical guidance. This is approved vertical navigation. It's an approved vertical path, just like in ILS. The GPS creates the glide path, but you get a true decision altitude, and most are down to 200, and a few are down to 250. It's identical to most ILSs. So all you do is, again, remember, you never have to step down from 3,700 to 26. You never have to do that step down because the glide path is going to go out to kayak anyway. Just fly forward at 3,700, and you'll actually pick up the glide path before you get to HWC. Now, I want to really caution you. Many avionics manufacturers are very proud of the fact that they offer VNAV. And many autopilot manufacturers are very proud of the fact that their autopilots can do vertical navigation. I want to strongly recommend that you disable VNAV systems, VNAV guidance out of your Garmin or Avidyne Navigator, and that you don't use them in the light GA world, because VNAV will hide a glide path because it just tries to step down to 2,600 and get exactly at HOSC. Then after you pass HOSC, then the LPV glide path will show up and you'll be too high and your autopilot won't capture it. So again, VNAV is wonderful in the jet and turboprop world, but I promise you VNAV, if you're using it, will only mess you up on most RNAV approaches. So it's a great system. I love it. I think the technology is wonderful. My personal preference is that you don't use it on approaches. So then you go down to a decision altitude, and then you go missed. All right, so I think we got the difference between, LPV and LP and LP plus V. Let's look at the RNAV Zulu 26 in Camarillo. This is kind of a weird approach because it only has LPV minimum, and it's got a little reverse print W in the top left. So let's just review our, instrument approach notates. A reverse print T means there's a standard instrument departure, an obstacle departure procedure, or there's non-standard takeoff minimums if you're an airline. The reverse print A with the not authorized next to it says you cannot list Camarillo Airport as an alternate using this approach. Doesn't mean you can't list Camarillo. You just can't use Camarillo as an alternate, or you can't list Camarillo as an alternate if you're planning on this approach. So what the heck is that reverse print W? Anybody? Daily WAAS outages. The Naval Air Station right there interferes with WAAS on a daily basis. So let me ask you a question. If you're flying a WAAS approach, an LPV approach, and WAAS fails, it would just go down to LP. It's not possible because LP is the WAAS. So if you're flying an LPV approach and you lose WAAS but still have GPS, you got to go to LNAV VNAV or LNAV minima only. And my recommendation is just go missed, come back around and figure it out after you rebrief the approach. So the big question everybody asks me is a WAAS LPV approach a precision approach? Well, yes. You fly it exactly like an ILS, and it even counts as a precision approach on the FAA IFR check ride if you don't have an ILS. And no, ICAO never considers LPV a precision approach when you pick an alternate. So we know it's more accurate than an ILS. We know we fly better on LPV. We know we can substitute LPV on the FAA check ride as a precision approach, but it doesn't count as a precision approach when you pick an alternate. And that's the key note. So let's review your alternate rules. I'm sure you all are familiar with the 1, 2, 3 rule. If 1 hour before or after your estimated time of arrival at your destination, the ceiling is forecast to be less than 2,000 feet, or the visibility is forecast to be less than 3 miles, you got to pick an alternate. And the standard airport qualifications are pretty simple. If your airport has an ILS or precision, PAR, precision approach radar, the forecast weather at the alternate has to be at least a 600-foot ceiling and at least 2 miles. If it only has non-precision, including all GPS and WAAS GPS, the requirement is an 800-foot ceiling and 2 miles visibility. Don't forget, you can also list any airport as long as you can get there under VFR conditions. And don't forget to check for non-standard alternate minimums in the TERP supplement, or they'd be on the jet plates. So remember, if WAAS fails, LPV is going to drop to LNAV, VNAV, or LNAV, and Avidyne will just pick whichever's lower and tell you to use that. But because the RNAV Zulu in Camarillo is WAAS only, you'll notice it can get you by that little low obstacle. If there's a WAAS outage, they actually break it into a completely separate procedure. So Zulus always get you lower than Yankee or X-ray. If you're doing a circling approach, Alpha gets you lower than Bravo or Charlie. So go from the outside of the alphabet in, and the outside are the lower minimums. But look at the RNAV Yankee. It is non-WAAS and has a much higher MDA, not a DA, because it can't clear that obstacle because the lateral course does not tighten up under LNAV like it does LPV. So let's talk. I'm never going to shoot an ILS into University Park unless GPS is broken, because LPV is better. It doesn't matter what the ATIS says. Look, folks, they list the ILS on the ATIS because it's the lowest common denominator. As long as you got a VOR, you can at least do the localizer half. Air traffic control does not prefer the ILS. The airport managers don't prefer the ILS. And the ILS is less accurate than an LPV. Just because it's on the ATIS has nothing to do with what you shoot. Got to tell you, all the air traffic controllers I know would prefer you do the LPV because it's more accurate and you're less likely to go missed and clutter up their airspace. So the only reason I'm ever going to do an ILS is if GPS is broken. And if GPS is broken, can I do the ILS or localizer 2.4 in the University Park? Well, no, because ADF's required. If GPS is working and I got a current nav database, it can substitute for the ADF requirement. But if GPS was working, I'd go to the GPS approach. So why is ADF required? I'm a little confused. They could vector me to final. I have a decision altitude. I don't have to identify the NDB of PENU at all as part of the ILS. It's because the alternate missed approach fix is the NDB. The Phillipsburg VOR is considered unreliable, and I think it's scheduled for removal. So you cannot legally accept an approach clearance if you can't legally do the missed and the alternate missed approach. So if GPS is out, can I shoot the ILS 2.4? Absolutely I can. I just have to tell New York Center that New York Center, King Air, whatever, level 8000, I've experienced a GPS outage. I'd like vectors to final for the ILS 2.4, University Park. Full stop with ATIS Yankee. I am negative ADF. Can I get alternate missed approach instructions? And they'll say, yeah, sure. If you need to go missed, climb runway heading to 5000. So you can do anything if you just ask ATC for a little bit of help. So let's talk about RNAV, standard instrument departures, with a heading transition. So RNAV, area navigation, most people just put their autopilots and GPS steering and good to go. That would get you in a lot of trouble at Oklahoma City. So if we zoom in a little bit and we're taking off on 17 left, right, or runway 13, runway 18, it says climb on a heading, not a track. Heading is a magnetic heading of 176 to 1800 feet, and then fly a heading, a magnetic heading, not a desired track, of 176, and expect radar vectors to collapse. And that's what's called a manual termination or a manual sequence, meaning we don't know when you're going to go direct collapse. So let's show you Oklahoma City doing simultaneous approaches. If I've got a plane on 17 left and 17 right, and both airplanes enable their autopilot at couple hundred feet off the ground whenever your autopilot's allowed, in heading mode, even if there's a 20-knot wind pushing that way, when the airplanes take off, they will both drift the same way and maintain aircraft separation. The problem is, so I was training a gentleman with a TBM 850 at Oklahoma City, and I told him, listen, for takeoff, put your flight director and everything in heading. And he goes, well, no, I do GPS steering. And I'm like, no, that's incorrect. And he really didn't listen to me. And I'm like, look, you got to stop and do this, because if the plane on 17 right is in heading, which is the correct mode, and you're in your little TBM on 17 left in GPS steering, you're going to fly a track and go straight out. Unfortunately, the wind is going to push the simultaneous departure off 17 right into you. This is your fault, and you can have a midair collision or a loss of separation. So the biggest danger in not using heading when it says heading, or not using GPS when it's GPS, is you could get a loss of critical aircraft separation. All right, let's look at an arrival, and this happens to be the Truck 2 RNAV arrival, and this is a Jeppesen plate. And you'll notice it just says a track of 190. And it says track 190. So you should leave your autopilot in GPS steering. If you want to look at a government plate, you actually see it says on the Truck 2 arrival from SASE, use a track of 266, right? So it says track 266 to Blico, then on track 242 to truck, then on track 190, expect radar vectors. So everything in there says track, track, track. If we look at the SASE 6 arrival, the Jeppesen plate actually adds the word heading. That's a magnetic heading. You got to switch your autopilot from GPS steering into heading and put your heading bug on 255. And it even says again in the routing, heading. If you look at the government chart, it doesn't show it on the government chart. You actually got to look at the second page of the government chart, and it'll say heading 255. So make sure you understand the difference. Now, the problem is even if you file RNAV, SIDS, or STARS, most flight plans will get rejected unless you tell the ICAO flight plan form that you're qualified to do RNAV, SIDS, and STARS, and that is not just putting slant gulf. You got to tell it ICAO equipment that you have with a WAAS navigation system that can do 8.33 frequencies. You're going to put Bravo, Golf, Romeo, Sierra. The Zulu is not possible. You're just going to select Bravo, Golf, Romeo, Sierra. Then this particular plane has ADS-B 1090 in and out, so it's going to be a Bravo 1 Echo, and it's got 978 in and out, and it's going to be Uniform 2. It's a light airplane, but under performance-based navigation, ICAO, I've chose Bravo 2, Charlie 2, Delta 2, Oscar 2, and Sierra 1. And the way I got the Zulu added to the ICAO equipment was by adding 4 items under other information. So first of all, you got to put in your code. And the code for this particular airplane is Alpha 62175. So how did I figure that one out? Well, you also need to tell it that you have WAAS. So what you need to do under NAV is tell it that you're a WAAS GPS equipped airplane, meaning you have space-based augmentation system. Remember ICAO form, ICAO abbreviations. But how did I get that code? Well, no problem. If you just go to the internet and change your browser to FAA.gov, and you look up your tail number under the N number lookup on the right side of the screen. And we'll look up my old 206 49er 401 Foxtrot. You See those mode S codes? There's a base 8 and a base 16. You want to use the base 16 hex code. So that's how you get your code for ICAO flight plans. Then if you put in space-based augmentation system and you add yourself as a performance level alpha, that's with a Garmin or Avidyne or Bendix King WAAS GPS. And then I put in my ADS-B in and out transponder, not necessary to get the Zulu, then you'll be approved for RNAV, SIDS, and stars. Well, it's coming up on an hour, and I've given you some bad jokes. Hopefully I've given you a couple good jokes. I've even had a couple typos because, I'm human like everybody else. Let's play a quiz. Y'all ready? RNP stands for A, Route Navigation Planning, B, Reset Navigation Performance, C, Required Navigation Performance, or D, Required Navigation Planning. Everybody, RNP stands for C, Required Navigation Performance. If you have a WAAS GPS like Garmin, Avidyne, or Bendix King, you can fly A, RNAV GPS with an RNP of 0.1, that's LP. B, RNAV GPS and LNAV VNAV. C, RNAV RNP with RF legs, or D, both A and B. Well, you are correct. It is D. You can fly any RNAV GPS. You are not authorized to fly RNAV RNP. All stars end with a manual termination or radar vector based on A, desired track. That's a GPS track. B, a magnetic heading. C, they always give you both options. Or D, either A or B. You are correct, everybody. It's either A or B. Make sure you understand the difference between desired track, autopilot and GPS steering, and magnetic heading, autopilot to heading bug mode. If a star ends with a manual termination with a heading, you should A, change your autopilot from GPS steering or nav to heading mode. B, make sure your autopilot is in GPS steering, not nav mode. C, disconnect the autopilot and you're only authorized to hand fly them. Or D, any of the above. Well, you can hide fly if you really want to. I recommend that you should just change your autopilot from GPS roll steering, GPSS, or nav to heading mode. Now, what's the biggest danger in using the wrong autopilot mode on a SID? Well, there is no danger if you just monitor ground track. As long as your for-flight plane looks right, you'll be okay. B, wind drift could cause a loss of aircraft separation. C, you might get an FAA violation even with certificate action. Or D, it increases ATC and pilot workload. Well, the key word on this, everybody, is biggest. The biggest danger is wind drift could cause a loss of aircraft separation and potentially even a mid-air collision. If you are flying an LPV approach, that's localizer performance with approved vertical navigation, and experience a WAAS outage, you can continue on the approach as long as other minimums are published under A, LNAV, B, LP plus V, C, LP only, or D, loss. Everybody, you are correct. A is the correct answer. You can continue using LNAV. If you ever see a reverse print W on an approach plate, that means A, it's a WAAS approach only. B, there are daily WAAS outages. C, WAAS is required. Or D, authorization from the FAA is required for WAAS approach. You are correct. That's B. There are daily WAAS outages. And the only one I know about is the Camarillo RNAV GPS Zulu to runway 26. If anybody knows of any other ones, please send me an email. So let's review the main difference between LPV and LP plus V is A, LPV has a decision altitude. LP plus V has a minimum descent altitude. B, LPV is WAAS, but LPV plus V is non-WAAS. C, LPV is RNP, but LP plus V is non-WAAS. Or D, they're the same. You are correct. A. LPV has a decision altitude. LP plus V is advisory in nature only. Add vertical. Stop high at the minimum descent altitude. Fly forward to the missed approach point and then go missed. Now, if we were going to compare LPV to ILS, A, they're the same. B, LPV is more accurate. C, ILS is more accurate. Or D, ILS is preferred by ATC, and that's why they put it on the ATIS. Everybody, B, LPV is more accurate. What about LNAV, VNAV? A is a WAAS approach with a decision altitude. B is a non-WAAS approach with a minimum descent altitude. C is non-WAAS with a decision altitude. Or D is WAAS with an MDA. So LNAV, VNAV is non-WAAS, but it is approved vertical navigation, and it does have a decision altitude. So general aviation, and I say Part 91, most general aviation pilots can fly an RNAV, RNP approach. A, if you just give a little bit of extra money to Jeppesen and pay for the extra RNP database. B, by manually entering the waypoints. C, if you receive the required training at your airline job. Or D, you're not authorized at all. The answer almost always is not authorized at all. Well, I hope you've enjoyed it. Sorry for the couple typos. Remember, LP is localizer performance. Sorry about that. If you'd like to really get good at Avidyne, ForeFlight, Garmin, Single Pilot IFR, come on over to pilotsafety.org. We have some great advanced mastery video training. You know, my Garmin G1000 course is very popular, sold thousands over many years. It's, like 6 hours long. My ForeFlight training is like 12 because Garmin doesn't add 10 new features to the G1000 every 3 days. And Tyson over at ForeFlight can't stop innovating if you tied him down. So all of my Avidyne, Garmin, and ForeFlight and IFR video trainings are now subscription, and they get continual updates. You'll get more in-flight videos. They never stop growing. And I just want to take a second and tell you all, thank you so much for making Single Pilot IFR Pro Tips my first book. Just a crazy seller. We sold 1,000 in the first 2 months, and on a good day can sell 100 copies a day. If you haven't had a chance to get it, please go grab a copy. If you just go over to pilotsafety.org and hit Single Pilot IFR or look for the book, it's my take on IFR. Really great instrument instructors teach things that are not appropriate for real-world IFR because really great examiners have to test things that don't really apply to real-world IFR. There's never been a time in my life that I've had to do 3 back-to-back approaches in 30 minutes. So IFR instructors teach you missed approach, missed approach, missed approach, missed approach. The examiner wants to see missed approach, missed approach, missed approach. Real world, seriously, with single pilot IFR and GA, you probably shouldn't fly into weather where you are going to go miss. You should stop at an alternate halfway to your destination. So this is not how to pass a check ride. It's not how to be a good examiner. It's 8,000 hours of real world experience teaching people all over the country and even a little bit internationally. These are the things that I think work better. It's entirely my opinion, and I gotta tell you, it's a really controversial book sometimes because I have a different viewpoint than other experts. And everyone that's ever gotten it has loved it. So please go over to pilotsafety.org and give me a chance. You know, for $29.95, it's a whole lot cheaper than hiring me anyway. But if you would like to fly with me, I do a 3-day single pilot IFR mastery training program where we'll do 3 days in your airplane with your GPS, your autopilot, your display, your iPad at your airport. It's a 45-hour class. You're going to get 20 to 25 hours of video training before I get there, an 8-hour ground school, and then the second and third days are all flying. And it is so intense that on the third day, you're going to break off the middle of an approach and go do a random unpublished DME radial hold. And on the very last approach, I'm simply going to turn off your panel completely and make you land using ForeFlight only. because the nightmare is not a vacuum system failure anymore. It's an electrical failure. So what will I teach, or where will I teach the 3-day programs? Oh, I don't care. The view on the left is a Beech 1900 in Anchorage, Alaska. The photos on the right are a Cessna 210 in Perth, Australia. I'll go anywhere, and I don't care if you have a King Air or a great little Diamond Star with no autopilot at all. I'm happy to help. If you have any questions, go on over to pilotsafety.org and click contact. Send me any questions or comments you have. And I hope you all enjoyed this course. If you ever see me out in public, it's pretty easy to spot me. Go, hey, pink shirt, come up, get a picture. I'd love to meet y'all. And I hope to see you soon. Thanks for attending this video training. And thanks for being part of the pink group at pilotsafety.org.